Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics, your bite-sized guide to the corridors of power. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan. Today we're focusing on a big story in the Middle East and what it might mean for the UK. Iran's president and foreign minister were among 9 top officials killed in a helicopter crash on Sunday in the northwest of the country. Foul play isn't suspected, but will now mean a change in the country's top leadership at a fractious time in the Middle East.
Remember, Iran backs Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and the Houthi militants that have been attacking ships in the Red Sea. So what happens in Tehran matters for the wider Middle East and for the wider world. Here's the view of the Tory MP Tobias Ellwood, who until last year was the chair of the Defence Select Committee and has previously held ministerial jobs in the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Defence.
Certainly the positions that craft Iran's foreign policy that affect us in the UK, that influence with the Houthis, Hezbollah and Hamas, they are the supreme leader, the president and the foreign minister. And 2 of those 3 are now currently missing.
So let's dig into the implications of these deaths for Iran and for the rest of the world. Joining us now is our EMEA News Director, Rosalind Mathieson, and Head of Bloomberg's Iran coverage, Golnar Motevalli. Now, Golnar, put these events in context for us. How big a change is this at the top of Iran's leadership?
We have to look at Raisi as a politician, as a character, the type of president that he was. And if we compare him to his predecessor, Hassan Rouhani, who was a political rival of Raisi, he was a very different type of president and politician. He didn't actually wield a huge amount of political influence. He was elected into office in 2021 in a presidential election that was widely seen by a lot of commentators and even members of the Iranian public as kind of choreographed and somewhat engineered to ensure that he would be elected and be take on the position of president. And for that reason, he's seen as someone who was just very loyal to the regime, to the Islamic Republic, and to the supreme leader Khamenei. And he wasn't somebody who perhaps had a vision that was very strong, that was that he then wanted to kind of imprint on other institutions in the government, like Rouhani. Rouhani had this very strong vision of ending the sanctions on Iran.
Because of course we had the talks over the nuclear deal under him.
Yeah, opening up a dialogue with the US. He very much pushed for that strategy. And when former President Donald Trump withdrew from that deal internally in Iran, it kind of ended that period of moderate politics in government, because people like Raisi and hardliners like him in Iran took that to be a failure of Rouhani and his allies, people like the foreign minister Javad Zarif. And so when Raisi became president, it was almost a message to say that the moderates have had their chance, it didn't work, the hardliners are going to take control of the show entirely. So with Raisi's election, all the major levers of the state, all the major institutions, from the judiciary, the executive, the legislative, then a year later in those parliamentary elections after Raisi was elected, the IRGC, all of them would be dominated by hardliners and hardline clerics. And I think Raisi was very much part of that ecosystem. And he wasn't necessarily a very authoritative speaker when he spoke publicly. He didn't, I don't think he kind of emanated a huge amount of charisma at all. He didn't have very strong speaking skills compared to someone like Rouhani. And all of this fed into the view that he was more of a sort of yes man for that role.
But I wonder, given that there will now be elections for a new president, does that open the door to a different sort of president now?
That's a very hard question, and I think what's going to be very interesting is who is so according to the Constitution, we should be expecting within the next 50 days to hear about a date for these elections, for a presidential election. And I think it's going to be really interesting and quite critical to see how the vetting process for the candidates for that election, how that process is going to take place. Because what enabled Raisi to become president was the fact that so many candidates were disqualified even before the race began, including quite conservative, high-profile establishment figures who had far more experience than Raisi. And that's why people felt that it was kind of choreographed to sort of kind of let him into that office allow him to take that position quite easily. So that's going to be really interesting to see who is allowed to run in the election. This caretaker president we have at the moment, Mohamed Mokhber, is also a very interesting character. He's very close to the IRGC. He's also quite close to some very powerful institutions, financial institutions that are close to the Supreme Leader and the Supreme Leader's office. So, there's a chance that he might actually want to throw his name in the hat as an official candidate in that election. Yeah. We just have to see.
Going on, we very recently had parliamentary elections in Iran. Of course, you've lived in Iran. How will Iranians be feeling about going to the polls again?
I think we've seen in that election that you just mentioned, the parliamentary election, and the previous presidential election in which Raisi was elected, we've seen really low levels of turnout. And that obviously speaks to the mood politically in society. And it's clear that there's a lot of discontent. We've seen that with these huge demonstrations that were triggered by the death of Mahsa Amini in September 2022, the young woman who was arrested for allegedly violating strict dress codes. So there's been a sort of feeling of political dejection and maybe even disenfranchisement for some time. And I would doubt that we would see a huge turnout for these elections. Having said that, again, it all depends on whose name is going to be on that ballot paper, and Khamenei is likely to use these elections. It's an opportunity always for him to claim some democratic credibility and credentials for his system.
Yeah.
So, and he can play around with that using the Guardian Council, which is the institution that vets and disqualifies candidates. And we might see something different this time compared to last time.
Ros, I want to bring you into the conversation at this point as well. I mean, this is a UK politics programme. We're wondering about how we should be thinking about this from London, how our political leaders should be thinking about this as well. Why is it that Iran is so central to so many conversations around foreign policy at the moment?
Well, because Iran has its fingers in so many pies, and it's important for a whole lot of reasons, including the global oil supply, which is fundamental to the questions about the global economy and inflation, but also the broader questions of stability in the Middle East. And Golnar's been talking about the impact within Iran, which is, very much in flux and significant. And there's also the impact outside Iran from this news. And does it mean anything for a whole bunch of things, including the Israel-Hamas war in Gaza, with Hamas backed by Iran? In the immediate term, probably not. Does it mean anything for other Iranian proxies operating in the region? Probably not. I mean, Golnar has noted in our blogging today, for example, that these are controlled by the military and not really the presidency. So they'll run on unchanged by all of this. Does it mean anything from Iran's relationships? Quite possibly, mainly around the US and the future of the nuclear accord, depending on who comes in and what their view is on that. They're probably likely to keep the trajectory either way for the relationship with Russia and China, and that's caused a lot of unease for countries, including the UK. This idea that you're getting these global power blocks building as alternate, buffers to the West, and that's, China and Russia alongside countries like Iran, who are forming these spheres of influence that are outside, again, the US-led global order potentially. That's a concern. And a big one, obviously, is the future of the relationship between Iran and Saudi Arabia, two of the biggest powers in the Middle East. And that's got to be of interest very much to policymakers in the UK and the US. Do we see those tentative steps between Saudi Arabia and Iran continue? We had the agreement in 2023 for diplomatic ties between the two, but it's still pretty fragile and tenuous, and there's a lot going on there, potentially also in the near term with succession in Saudi Arabia too, with the health of the king. And there's a lot of unknowns in all of that, unknowns even. And for countries like the UK, working out what that all means and what it means for the UK directly is going to be a key question.
You say it's unlikely there will be big changes in policy, but do you think there's a chance that this may lead to a slightly less strident Iran, perhaps a less confident Iran?
I think that's a really interesting question, but listening to the analysis we've had today on this news, including from Golnar, it seems like what they will want is continuity and control in Iran. And Raisi was a hardliner. Yeah, he didn't have a lot of direct influence himself. He was really in lockstep with the Supreme Leader. But does the Supreme Leader want change? Probably not. So from his end, you're looking at continuity, the desire at least for that, when it comes to policy both at home and abroad. And that really is a much more hardline tack that they've been taking.
Golnar, I wonder, the question of who succeeds the Supreme Leader as well is also in question here, because Raisi had been tipped as one of those who might potentially be in line to do that. What happens with that now? Does that create a space for somebody else?
I mean, it kind of does. And, there's been a huge amount of discussion on this. And I think, the two names that have always kind of been raised as front runners to take over Khamenei. One of them was obviously Raisi. The other one is Khamenei's son, Mojtaba. There are other names, slightly lesser known names as well, that are often kind of thrown out there. As much as Raisi was seen as a front runner, his experience as in the presidential seat, as it were, as president, can in some ways almost be seen as some sort of rehearsal exercise, and he lost by quite a heavy margin against Rouhani, and therefore I think they would have struggled to have given him some heft and legitimacy as a supreme leader. Having said that, there are other analysts and academics who I've spoken to in the past recently, who have said that the office of the Supreme Leader after Khamenei's death is not going to look the same. You'll never have the same level of authority that Khamenei wielded.
Such a fascinating and complex set of issues being viewed as a foreign policy issue, of course, here from London, but really great to get your analysis. Thank you to Golnar Motevalli, our head of Iran coverage, and our EMEA news director, Rosalind Mathieson, to both of you for joining us on the programme. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. You'll find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by James Walcock, and our audio engineer was Sean Grostamacchia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.